I'm going to be taking you through how to use the communication pie for the purposes of analysing a text. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, there's three segments. You have in the first segment the people, so that's the relationship between the composer and the responder, simply put, the information, the ideas that are being communicated, and the mode of expression, how the information is organised. And you'll see that there's a variety of different parts to this diagram. Now, it's important to understand that when you're using this, you're not really expected to use every single aspect at once. This can be used for a variety of different purposes, and today I'm just going to be taking you through one specific use of it, which is to analyze a text. But I'll take you through the parts. So first of all, you've got the basic prompts. So they're basically some questions to help you think about, for example, the relationship between the people in the context that the text is in. Likewise, the type of information that's being communicated and how that information might be organised. Secondly, we've got a quick one-sentence summary of the focus of that segment. And then you've got the elements, so the broader ideas, the broader patterns that you might be looking at in that segment. That's what we're going to be focusing on today, along with the verbs. So you can see that there's some verbs in those boxes around the outside of the pie, and they're some verbs that we can use in our analysis to actually explain what effect the language is creating. The other thing to probably keep in mind is that you can move two ways when you're using the pie. If you've got a text that you're unfamiliar with, you can start from the inside and work your way out. So you can start from the actual language features and move your way out to the context. If, on the other hand, you know a fair bit about the context, you might move from the outside in to understand how that context is constructed through the language. Today, in this video, I'm just going to focus on one way. I'm going to focus on starting from the inside and moving out. So going from the language, the specific language features that we might identify in the text, and then moving out to help us to understand what's going on in that particular context. So the first segment we're looking at is people, and people is all about the relationship between the composer and the responder. When we're looking specifically at the language, we're looking at language that influences the responder's reaction to the text. So that can be how the composer wants the responder to feel about the text, the kind of attitude that they might want them to adopt towards the text and towards themselves. And whether or not they actually want the responder to do something as a result of the text. So it's about using language to get other people to do something, think something, feel something, or change their attitude in some way. So I'm using an example from a poem by Bruce Storr. It's called Weapons Training. And it's basically a dramatic monologue, and it's spoken by a drill sergeant to a bunch of new recruits. I've taken an extract out of this to look at the way that this is constructed through the language. So look to your front. If you had one more brain, it'd be lonely. What are you laughing at? You in the back row with your unsightly fat between your elephant ears. Open that brain you call a mind and listen. Remember first. And it goes on from there. So the soldier follows the instructions. So I'm just going to read that through again. The composer uses imperative in look to your front to direct the responder to follow orders. So now we can see how the language here, the imperative in the quote, look to your front, is being used to somehow maintain or establish a relationship between the drill sergeant and the soldier. And that relationship here is one of power. So you can see here how the language reflects that context. So we've looked at the P segment, now we're going to move on to the I segment, so that's the information. And in the I segment, it's all about the language that influences the responder's understanding of the information. Going to our same example, the one from Bruce Storr, and again there's a set of language techniques that are fairly closely tied to the way we represent information. So you can see again we've got, for example, simile, metaphor, symbolism, description, synecdoche, personification, jargon, and pun. So these are all language devices that somehow change the meaning, the literal meaning of the word, to communicate something else. So the example that I've identified here is that we've got open that drain you call a mind. So it's metaphorical. So doing the same thing that we did with the P segment, we're going to transfer that into a scaffolded sentence. And you'll see that it's very similar to the sentence that we used for this P segment. This time it's the composer uses, and that we put in the technique again, then in the quote, to, and so that's where our verb goes. The only difference here is that we are adding some kind of interpretation. So obviously we don't want to just say, when we're saying that it's a metaphor, just saying that the composer is saying that the person has a mind that's like a drain. It's only really telling us exactly what has been said. It's giving us, it's describing. What we need to do is take that a little bit further. We need to interpret. What is it that the composer is trying to get at here? What is it that they want us to understand when they use this metaphor? So in this case, the reason why the composer has compared the mind to a drain is because the soldier can't remember anything. And so you can see again that we've got that structure in the sentence, and you can use that as a scaffold to work your way through analysing a quote. So I'll just read that again. The composer uses metaphor in drain you call a mind to suggest that the soldier can't remember anything. So that leaves us with the third segment, the mode of expression. Now, in some ways, this one's a little bit more difficult, but it's also in some ways more powerful once you get your head around how it works. This one's really all about structures and patterns. And in talking about structures and patterns, we're talking about the way that the composer organizes information to shape the way that the responder experiences the text. So it's language that influences the responder's experience. So if we have another look at our example, so I've got once again the same quote, and this time I've identified rhyme. So rhyme's a pretty easy one. You can see that it's in the middle there, with other examples like anastrophe, ellipsis, motif, alliteration, asyndeton, isocolon, repetition, and truncation. So you'll see that they're all techniques that are somehow playing with the structure, so the way that the words are ordered, the patterns, and how that information is organized. So once again, we're going to take our technique, our quote, and our verb, and we're going to use a sentence scaffold to put all of those together to get our analysis. So we've got the composer uses the technique, in this case it's rhyme, which we've taken from the communication pie. We've got our quote from the poem, brain and drain, because they're the words that rhyme. And then we've got our verb, in this case it's reinforce. And finally, we're going to put in an effect. So what is the effect of this particular technique? In this case, it's to create a connection between brain and drain. Now again, that's pretty simple in terms of what we're identifying as an effect, but it's then what we'll do with that later that is going to be the far more powerful part of putting that into some kind of response. So just for a bit of a recap, we've been using the communication pie and two parts of the communication pie in particular. The middle section, which is all of our techniques, and the verbs that are associated with the three segments of the pie, because each of the segments do something different, which means that the verbs are going to be different. And from there, we can then put those pieces from the pie and from our verbs and from our quote that we're analysing into the relevant sentence structure. And so I've got those three here. You'll see that they're all very similar. The only thing that really changes is the very end of the sentence. So you've got, in all of them, you've got your technique after the composer uses, then you've got your quote, then you've got your verb. The difference is where in the first one, for the P segment, it's the goal. In the second one, we've got again technique, quote, and verb. But in this case, we've got how we then interpret that information, so the understanding that we need to get from it. And finally, we've got in the E segment, the technique, quote, and verb, but in this case, we're looking more just at a general effect. Somehow, the way that this particular technique shapes the structure, and by shaping the structure, shapes the experience of the text. I'll also provide some more resources in terms of a more extensive list of verbs and a more extensive list of techniques associated with particular segments of the pie.